I think we have all seen the pivot that the Ultimate Fighting Championship, led by Dana White, has made, especially since his good friend Donald Trump entered the world of politics and won the presidency in 2016. My next guest is a man who has been in those press conferences with Dana White. He is a journalist and has worked for various organizations, including Showtime, CBS, MMA Fighting, SB Nation, the list goes on and on. We discuss this intersection of sports and politics, how the UFC has essentially served as the propaganda arm for MAGA, and how they captured the manosphere to hand Donald Trump yet another term as President of the United States. Without further ado, here is my next guest, Luke Thomas. All right, y'all, welcome back in. We have a very special guest today. This is someone that I deeply, deeply respect in the world of mixed martial arts and also in politics. If you have seen his tweets, if you have seen his posts, I don't want to say tweets anymore. If you have seen his posts on Substack, Blue Sky, Threads, what have you, Luke Thomas joins the program. One half of Morning Combat, Luke Thomas on YouTube and also on Substack. Luke, thank you for joining me, my good man. How are you?
Rick, it's been too long, but I'm happy to be back. Nice to see you. Nice to talk to you.
It has been too long. You were born in India, is that correct?
Yeah, my dad was in the Foreign Service, so not only was I born in India, but I have two siblings, an older brother and older sister. All of them were born out of the country, and my mother is, she's ethnically, she's deceased, but she was ethnically Armenian and from Lebanon. So only my dad is the only like hardcore white guy in the family. You know what I mean? He's the guy. He's the standard bearer.
I'm sorry for your loss. No, I'm serious. I'm
on my mom. Yeah, sorry. I thought you were
mom.
insulting
Yes.
my dad. Yeah, no, thank you, Brad. It's quite nice, but it's okay to make fun of my dad too. That's fun. That's fun as well.
Your dad served, is that correct?
Yeah, my dad was worked for the State Department. He was a low-level diplomat, but a diplomat. He worked for Bush Senior when Bush Senior was ambassador to the UN. He worked in his press office. So yeah, I mean, my dad saw some stuff.
And then did that influence you to go serve as well?
Sort of. Not really. No. I briefly kicked the tires at the end of college on, did I want to go into Foreign Service? I did not. At least, at the time I certainly did not. This was also the year after 9/11. So I graduated, I graduated 2002. So like, there was just a lot of things going on in the world at that time. And I joined the military as a reservist in the Marine Corps when I was 17, and that was really just to see what the Marine Corps was like. I didn't have any long-term designs on having a life in the military or something. I just wanted to set a term, serve it, and be done, and I did. So I mean, I suppose there's like some overlap in terms of how our lives went in certain ways, but no, he did that. He had a full career in it. He retired from that, and I just, briefly dabbled in the military.
What was it like?
The Marine Corps in the 90s was wild, bro. It was, yikes. I mean, the reality is I'm very, very glad I did it. I am glad I got to see that part of that part of the world. I'm glad I got to, join a fraternity like that, which is what it is. Anybody who served will tell you that. But, again, I to be in the Marine Corps at the time that 9/11 happened was a very strange time. And, I think the reality is, and I'm not trying to besmirch the Marine Corps, but I'm just trying to be honest about how I understood it. If my daughter ever, she's 5, but if she ever decided to grow up, obviously she can make her own decisions. But if she ever asked my advice on joining the military, I wouldn't necessarily dissuade her, but I would definitely dissuade her from joining the Marine Corps, for sure. I would not encourage that. I don't like the Marine Corps that I grew up in. I don't think was super awesome to women. among other problems. So it's, it's like anything in life. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I think I learned some of the toughest lessons. I had some of the most important times of my life. It was professionally very rewarding, and I enjoyed a lot of it. At the same time, it's not for everybody. And I think you have to kind of see that clearly for what it is. To be clear, for folks who are listening, I did not serve as an officer. So the Marine Corps does not have an ROTC program. And I was in the Marine Corps at the same time I was an undergrad. So my only option was to do it as a reservist. And that was what enabled me. I did do 2 years on the back end after I graduated as part of like the deal for some GI Bill money, which, wasn't much, but paid for books, paid for meals. It was helpful, certainly in the end.
You mentioned something that I want to follow up on. You said that it's a tough place for women. Everywhere is a tough place for women. Not to minimize it, but how exactly would it be difficult for your daughter, hypothetically in that scenario, or if any woman wanted to serve? Granted, as you said, these were different times, but how exactly?
Maybe there's a couple different ways I could answer that. I would say one, again, the current way in which it runs could be very different, but the time in which I was in it, I did not see that talented women were properly considered for their abilities. That's one. Two, and this is not anything, I'm not breaking any news about this, and it just is a reality about military life more generally, but I think the Marine Corps specifically, I think, there's a problem with sexual harassment or worse in the workplace there. And again, you could go into the Air Force and have a terrible experience with both of those things. Like you can go to any sector in the workforce and have those. And to be clear, it should also be noted that I'm sure there's been a gazillion women who have served in the Marine Corps quite proudly and enjoyed their time. And, it's a range of experiences. But I was in artillery, which is, it's a combat arms unit. And I just did not get the impression that women were very wanted in a place like that. And to the extent that they were there, there were conditions on their participation that I found something I would never want to see my daughter have to go through. So, yeah.
Right. Very much so. Is it true that you joined a martial arts program while you were in the Marine Corps?
Well, they made us. They at the time, it all is part of how it works now. And at the time, Army had the combatives program, which is a very good program. It's a really, really strong. It's the strongest martial arts program that any of the services have. It's quite good. And the Marine Corps was trying to play catch up because the Marine Corps kind of prides itself on like, oh, whatever the Army does, we do it a little bit further. They run 2 miles on their PFT. We run 3. They do, you know what I mean? Like it's always like that. Their boot camp is 8-9 weeks. Ours is 13. Like it's everything is them plus, 50% more. And but the Marine Corps martial arts program at the time was like just being developed or just at the time being then like disseminated into the troop ranks more broadly as like an initiative in the Marine Corps. So they made us do that. But that then led to me taking a little bit of judo while I was in college. And then that then put me on a path to subsequent things once I got out that kind of scratched that itch that all began from that. It's kind of funny. There was that Netflix the Netflix program. I think it was called like Ruby something or Ridge something. It had the main protagonist is like the super jacked African American guy. Like what the hell was his name? I forget the name of it. But the premise is like it's the guy's on his bike and then he comes to this town where the cops are like out of control and he has this like standoff with them. And it's funny. They're researching in the show. They're like researching him and they're like, it says here he was an instructor at the Marine Corps martial arts program. And I'm like, that doesn't mean shit. Just for the record, you know what I mean? Like. He probably knows how to defend himself. You know what I mean? Like, I get it's Hollywood, but it's like, that is not, like, the Army Combatives is like a real program. And they call it MCMAP. MCMAP has gotten a lot better, but at the state that I was in, it was not, it was in its very developmental stages.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, sort of a similar question to what I asked you previously about your father and you serving and potentially leading to inspiration, rather, of you serving. Did that help you develop? Because you are an MMA journalist. I should have stated that in the beginning. Should we view it as this martial arts program and doing judo probably potentially at least led to you getting the itch and scratching it through your career in media?
I think it started earlier than that, and that those things you found along the way are just ways I expressed it on like the timeline of my life.
Mm.
Like, I grew up I'm 45, so I was born in late 79. So a child of the 80s. I grew up in the age of Hulk Hogan, Rambo, Schwarzenegger, Bruce Lee, and on top of that, Mike Tyson. And this is a time when culture was limited in terms of who it gave star power to or who ascended. And I don't think it's strictly a Hollywood thing, but I had an interest in the martial arts and fighting as long as I can remember. As
Mm-hmm.
long as I can remember, I don't have any taste in cinema early as a child, but for that. And the reality was kind of funny was that my parents really never let me do that stuff. They thought it was either a waste or, it was just some kind of reason or another. My mom also and my parents were divorced. And so there was a lot of moving around. So, that always kind of impacted it too. But it was just a thing that I always liked. I was always fascinated with, like my favorite, and again, this started back when I was I was like 14 or 15. My favorite video game is Mortal Kombat. Like
Oh
it
yeah.
just all kind of goes back to that place because there's just been something about fighting that I've always found fascinating. Now, again, it did so happen that maybe some of that was, on the back burner of my life or personality, and then the Marine Corps kind of re-energized it. Certainly, you could make that claim, but it didn't start there. It actually started much before that.
Are we talking Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis?
We're talking Mortal Kombat at the arcade, bro. We're talking Mortal. I mean, arcades used. I mean, you have Dave and Buster's and shit, but I mean, like,
Yeah, but it doesn't compare. It's so
doesn't
different.
compare. People don't. I mean, again, if you watch Terminator 2 and you see the two teens,
Mm-hmm.
John Connor and his friend, you can see what an arcade was like back then, like how it was the focal point of teenage life.
Yes.
That's absolutely accurate, and that's actually where I remember as I had heard, because you might remember this, the game that was kind of big for us at that time that preceded Mortal Kombat, but was known for like being gory and was Narc. I don't know if you
I do
remember
not remember
Narc.
it.
Oh, it was just the first like real bloody hardcore game. And then I remember someone was like, "There's this new video game. It's like Narc, but it's a fighting game." And you can rip people's hearts out and like da 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 da. Da. And I was like, I got to see this. And then I saw it, and it was like,
Yeah.
you were baptized that day, kind of a thing. So, um, I'm not sure exactly where all this is leading, but you
Doesn't
can
matter.
just see like these are the things I've just kind of always orbited around, for a lack of a better description.
Right. Well, your media career is pretty fascinating to me. You started a blog which was called Mad Squabbles. And then you went on to broadcast for Ultimate Warrior Challenge. You worked for SB Nation as a senior editor. You have worked for SiriusXM. You were the editor-in-chief of Bloody Elbow. You've had stints with MMAfighting.com, Showtime, CBS Sports. We've talked about this a little bit. This was probably a month or two ago, probably 2 months ago. You've seen a lot in your day with media, as I have as well. What do you make of the space currently in the year 2025?
I think it's in a bad place. I think it's getting worse too. It's not that there is. I mean, it's not that there's not good work that's out there. There absolutely is, and I think there will continue to be. It's not one of those things where you're like everything will be homogenized into one kind of form of content. But I don't know how you can. There's a real basic problem, and the basic problem is that no one has with there's going to be exceptions, but as a general sort of like guiding principle or guiding reality, I should say, no one has figured out how to make money in media on the internet. Now, of course, as I mentioned, there are going to be exceptions. You can find a YouTube star and they can make money. You can find somebody who can generate a star. You could use that model, the star model, where you hire somebody very famous. They have a kind of like a very close following, and you can use that. But that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is to using the various different tools of the internet, creating a hub for talented people to come together under an op, you know, in operations, but an editorial vision, concept, and then using those collective tools for this collective media end, and then trying to sell ads against that content. That model simply does not work. I mean, it doesn't work. And people were like, well, what about the New York Times? The New York Times sells subscriptions off the back of games and recipes. I mean, I was in the Washington Post office. I think you might know him as well. Do you know W. Kamau Bell?
Yes, of course.
The comedian.
He had a show on, I think it was CNN, where he interviewed Richard Spencer.
United Shades of America.
Yes.
Yeah. He did an event at the Washington Post, and he invited me. And, you can tell that they're like propped up by a billionaire there. And I say this as a lifelong Washington. This was 2024.
Oh my God. Okay.
This was because like that year, I think the year before that, maybe 2023, it's either 2023 or so. They lost $100 million that year, and I went in the office and I was like, yeah, I can see how like that kind of operation does not work. It simply does not work. It cannot work. It will not work, and even smaller ones can't really work. And to the extent that even when you can find a way to make it work, it's a very fleeting kind of business model. Like, for example, I mean, they've been enduring to a degree, but I don't know how much longer the website has as any kind of viable place upon which, I mean, again, you might have a Substack model where people kind of operate both as an app and a website, or even more in between. But this is the central problem. What they basically thought was there was this advent of the blogging world in the aughts, and then there was a lot of venture capital money that came in the 2010s, and there was this belief that, okay, we haven't quite got this figured out right now, but give us a few years, we'll figure out what the model is, and then we'll make it all work. And that's, for the most part, just simply not true. It's just really not true. That it's certainly, even to the extent that it might be true in certain cases, and it has been, it's not true to the extent that they thought it would be, not even close. Mm-hmm. And now that model, even the one that they were pumping a bunch of money into, is, I think, going to go. I mean, again, I don't know how much longer websites have as kind of like a currency in media. And then you get to a different problem, which is now we have total hegemony by the tech platforms. If you want to win on media now, you have to win on Instagram. You have to win on YouTube or TikTok. This is how you can generate. But of course, what's the problem with that? The problem is that now everybody is slave to an algorithm. That's why everybody's thumbnails look the same. That's why everyone's podcasts, for the most part, again, some exceptions here or there, sound the same, because the algorithm necessarily requires that it looks that way. And so between the lack of this financing model, between the lack of tech innovation, between the lack of places to go where you can actually make journalism work in the way in which it was intended, we're in a bad place. We didn't even get to the talk about, like, the decline in local news and the decline in trust more generally. Like, it's just a gigantic problem. But from the nuts and bolts of it, that seems to me be these are irreconcilable problems, and I don't really know how it's all going to go.
I'm glad that you brought up that if someone wants to build their audience, they have to be enslaved to an algorithm, because it is objectively true. And a really good show that still does journalism is Pablo Torre's show. And he was talking about this on Pablo Torre Finds Out. His YouTube show and podcast is fantastic. How everybody at this point in media is chasing an algorithm. That is not healthy for this space. We're looking at different parts of media just evaporate into thin air. And like an example that I recently saw, whether you like him or not, it doesn't matter. Jim Acosta, after he left CNN, went to Substack. So now it's almost like you're competing against all these people that have been in media for decades upon decades. And everybody is now, because the industry has said it, go independent. You have to go independent. You have to build your YouTube. You have to build your Instagram, as you said. You have to build your Substack and what have you. Yet the competition was already bad, and we already thought it was oversaturated, and now it is completely oversaturated. And to your point about thumbnails, nothing sticks out anymore. Everybody, even glaring example, and I'm long-winded here. Glaring example, Tom Brady was doing reaction shot thumbnails for his YouTube. So like, this is where we are at this point. So I agree with you. From a journalism perspective, what is next in your eyes?
Obsolescence. I mean, there's so many other problems with that. Like, so on one thing you just mentioned, Tom Brady doing it. Here's another thing. And again, I don't really necessarily mind it, but it's just a reality that you have to contend with. So on the sports side, now you're seeing all of these former athletes get into the podcasting game. And for the most part, that's not necessarily a big deal. These are jobs that used to be filled by people like me, and that's less true. And again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But like, just take the case of MMA, for example, where like, in certain cases you had guys who made a bunch of money in their career also just want to make money on YouTube. Like even Cristiano Ronaldo has a YouTube channel. Like he's not doing reaction videos, but he might get to it just if it's lucrative enough, right? Like whatever ends up just kind of guiding him, he might end up doing. And the fact that Tom Brady is doing stuff like that is kind of depressing. But in the MMA or combat sports side, it's, these are not, these in the MMA side in particular, these are not guys that made a lot of money necessarily. And this is now their chance to actually make a lot of money. But what it ends up doing is, and again, I want to be clear, I'm not like, oh, they're taking our jobs, but you have to just now reconcile that those were jobs that those guys never wanted before. And now all of a sudden, all of them want it. And in certain cases, combat sports or basketball or whoever, they can be quite good at it. In fact, they can be amazing at it. This is what I mean. Like, this is not one of these complaints that like, oh, they're here now and they're not even good at it. In many cases, they're amazing and it works really well, but not in every case. And in a lot of cases, in fact, like any other profession, this is now a secondary one that they're choosing. They want to like, part of the problem with sports media, I think, was that these guys never put up enough boundaries. But if you put up boundaries with the subjects you cover now, you just get iced out. A lot of these guys who are former athletes, they have a connections with either guys they played with or just other famous celebrities, and no one's really taking them to task. And again, I want to be clear, there are guys that like, for example, like I come from All the Smoke, the two guys, Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson. I fucking love what they do, and I feel like I get so much out of it. And there's many other ones like that on the combat sports side. So it's not an either or, but this is just a powerful attraction. Like, people are very, very attracted to this. And in certain cases, it's not journalism. In certain cases, it is. But either way, whatever you want to call it, it has just drained the life out of the media economy that used to exist around this kind of programming. Yet another challenge. So it's like, the reality. It's something this is something I recognized circa 2016, but it's just never been truer than it is now. If you are in this space, you have to cultivate your own following, and it sucks that you have to think of it that way rather than producing work of quality.
Yes.
But this is just where we are. If you want to work in this business, unless you could be a special case of figuring all this stuff out, you will die without your own audience. It's just as simple as that. So tough times is what I think is ahead.
Incredibly tough times. I personally, as someone who's been in media professionally since 2011, studied it in college, did it since I've been 11 years old, 12 years old. I don't want to cultivate a following. I don't want to have a job and then do another job and then have a job as a social media person to post all my stuff at all times. As I've told my wife, there's only so many hours in a day. I'm not content with building slowly. But the other issue is that, and the point of entry is so minimal. All you really need is your phone at this point. You upload your analysis and you're considered a member of the media. You look at another example, politically speaking, the White House press pool is allowing just about anybody in as long as they support the regime and have a following. These are not journalists. These are pundits and opinionists, which also sort of leads to my next point. From a media perspective, in your world of professional mixed martial arts, One experiment that did not work, clearly, was when the UFC team, they still have, their thing going on, but they teamed up with ESPN. And they tried a square peg, round hole approach with Stephen A. Smith. What do you make of them assigning Stephen A., and do you believe that it was a failure?
The UFC and ESPN relationship is just fraught more generally at this point. It's a really interesting kind of conversation. We don't have all that much time to get into it, but those two people are those two entities are in a weird place. When they signed their deal, what was it, 6 or 7 years ago at this point? The first few years of that deal was just a rousing success, and that's really where you saw Stephen A. for the most part, was early on, early big events, early. Let's get the word out about UFC on ESPN at the time. And this is part of the reason why ESPN signed UFC, was to help build their ESPN Plus subscription base. And then UFC was very, very instrumental in doing that. For folks who may not know, prior to the ESPN deal, if you want to buy UFC pay-per-view, folks will remember, you could probably just go to your Verizon or Comcast or whatever, your DirecTV, whatever it was, and you could buy from there. And then when they went to ESPN, 100% of pay-per-view buys had to happen through ESPN Plus. And so that was a big driver for them. And so this was all about getting the word out in that sense. To be honest, the Steven thing didn't work. There was one kind of famous thing where he said against the Conor that Cowboy Cerrone, kind of quit. And then there was a lot of backlash. And then Cerrone kind of half confirmed it. And, Steven, I think, took a little bit of shine to that. I worked with Steven one time on the boxing side, which was for Showtime. He joined us on the, it was a very informal thing, but he joined us on the Spence Crawford weigh-ins, and he was very friendly. And I've actually watched a lot of his boxing coverage. I think his boxing coverage is actually pretty helpful for well, either Top Rank, who's on UFC, or excuse me, on ESPN, or really any entity he takes interest in. I think that is a partnership that actually works pretty well. It did not work with UFC audiences. Again, for hardcore fans, it didn't work. From ESPN's point of view, did he help raise visibility and help drive subscriptions to their service? Probably they got something out of it, but it didn't last long enough for it to really matter. Like of all the things I think about now between UFC and ESPN and where that deal might go and where they are now, what happened with Steven is like at the bottom of the list. You know what I mean? Like it's a perfectly reasonable question because at the time it was so hot, but they're so far into such a different place that it's like, honestly, I'm not saying that fans might welcome back Steven, but the point I would make is ESPN appears to be so unhappy with UFC. I don't think they would even want to waste Steven's time. That's kind of the difference.
Why do you feel that way?
Well, you might, and I think he's done it even recently, you'll still see Dana White or potentially some other big UFC star do First Take. There's still big overlap with that. Like, that is absolutely still a thing that would happen. But what you were referring to was putting Steven on a UFC broadcast. The basic answer of what has happened, and this is kind of again, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of it, or a little bit shorter. The UFC is a monopoly. It does not matter what definition of monopoly. I mean, it's a monopsony, so it's not one seller, it's one buyer, but it's a monopoly. It's a monopoly by any measurement. I mean, all the way, understand something. We're now in 2025. There are documents that we found from a class action lawsuit that their fighters waged against them from Deutsche Bank in 2009, saying of every dollar generated in the MMA industry, so the whole bit, the UFC takes 90 cents. That was 2009. Their power has only entrenched since then. They have the vast majority of the world's best fighters, but what has happened over time is in 2016, the people who really built the UFC into the thing that you knew to be that powerhouse, the McGregor powerhouse, the Ronda Rousey powerhouse, they sold to Endeavor, which of course, now is TKO, or well, Endeavor kind of split, but you get the same idea, same ownership group. And they have gone from the let's build this thing to a global phenomenon into just a wealth extraction business. And You could ask any, like, go on Reddit for MMA now, and like, by all means, don't take my word for it. Look at the amount of fan consternation about the state of the product. Like, no one else can compete because of how much they control the industry, but at the same time, they're penny pinching in ways where you're seeing elite prospects emerge on the regional scene, and the UFC doesn't want to match what they're paying or being paid by a regional, like, like what they're making in Poland. They don't want to match what some of these guys are making in Poland, and so you're missing out on top prospects. They put out content every week where it's a lot of just nameless faces and whatnot. And more to the point, what's the most interesting part is that pay-per-view, used to be the most important way in which they made money. And it's still very, very important, but understand something about pay-per-view. If you put on Brock Lesnar, you'll sell a gazillion pay-per-view buys, or at least in his heyday, you would have.
Mm-hmm.
If you put on me, you're not going to sell much at all. And so at that point, you're in the superstar business. But what they ended up doing is changing their business model through 2016 to a degree where they went to contracted revenue. So they were trying to get as much baked into how they do their operations rather than what they even called a lumpy way to make money, where you have a big Brock fight, it hits. You have a big Conor fight, it hits. Those are still important things to have, certainly. I don't want to minimize it, but it's not the same. And so there's become this kind of like homogenization, and they haven't really invested in building stars. If I had to ask someone who's the biggest star in the UFC, you can't count Conor and you can't count John Jones. Could the casual fan even tell me anybody who that is? Mm-hmm. Could you tell me who the biggest celebrity female fighter is today in MMA? I mean, this used to be a very easy question to answer. You could say Ronda Rousey and then several of her chief rivals. Those days are long since past. And so ESPN, to answer the question, has basically, I won't say stopped, but they put on free TV far fewer UFC events than they ever have. They rarely put it on linear TV. I mean, I remember when Cain Velasquez fought Francis Ngannou. When that event ended, they went to a hosted by Ariel Helwani and Chael Sonnen version of Sports Center. I don't think it's happened since. That you absolutely never see that kind of thing, because it looks like ESPN, I think they would still want to be in business to some degree with UFC, particularly on the pay-per-view side, but those numbers have fallen off a cliff. It's been widely reported those numbers have declined dramatically. Again, part of that is the change in the nature of pay-per-view. That's independent of how UFC runs their business, but ESPN appears to be quite unhappy with the state of their deal, and some of the problems are their own. ESPN Plus is the worst streaming service that exists on earth. I don't care what anybody else says, and like they have often ruined a good UFC night more than a time or two. But let's just say that there's a lot of friction these days between ESPN and UFC.
I want to go back to something that you said. They are not building prospects anymore, and they will not match the fee of, in your example, a prospect who is in Poland. Considering how much money they generate, and we know the net worth of some of the biggest players at Endeavor, even though they split, but some of the highest names, as you alluded to, why would they not match? It doesn't necessarily make sense to me why they wouldn't want to build their own farm system per se to showcase prospects.
So they do build some prospects. It's not like they don't build any. And they do have their own farm system. It's called the Ultimate Fighter and then the Contender Series. And the reason why those contracts are relevant is because if you win on the Contender Series or if you win the Ultimate Fighter, it locks you into a deal with them at a certain price point that is very, very affordable to them for an extended period of time. Of course, a lot of these guys wash out because they're not very good, but there is some kind of a feeder system. Some of those guys and ladies are good. Some of them do break through. I want to be very clear about that. Mm-hmm. But it's not nearly the talent acquisition pipeline that once existed. I mean, they used to be aggressive about oh, there's a person out there that's a big interest. We got to go get him. I mean, how do you think Conor McGregor got to the UFC? Conor McGregor got to the UFC because he won 2 titles in 2 different weight classes in the #1 kind of regional promotion in Europe called Cage Warriors. He was like making noise big time, and that's why they ended up signing him. Like this is what I mean. Like they used to do this kind of thing very, very aggressively, and that was circa like 2013 or so. So about 12 years ago. Let me tell you what's happening so you can really understand it. I'll give you a great example. So there's a guy who fights in Europe. His name is Saladin Parnasse. Saladin Parnasse is a guy in his mid-20s who recently, he failed at it, but he recently tried to become the first fighter in MMA history to win 3 different titles in 3 different weight classes. And this is not like boxing where they can be 5 or 7 pounds apart. These are cases where they're 10, 15, sometimes 20 pounds apart. And he failed at this. It was a bridge too far, but he's still a double champ. So he's still at a bare minimum a champ in 2 different weight classes. This guy is I mean, can I curse on this at all?
Yeah,
I don't know if that's
you already did.
Yeah, okay. This is a no bullshit prospect if ever there was one. I mean, the guy looks like he's chiseled out of stone. He is in his 20s. His power carries across multiple weight classes. He's well-rounded. He's proven against veterans. And like if you are looking to sign the bet, it's like Cooper Flag. You know what I mean? This is what you're looking at here. I mean, that might be a little bit overstated, but it's pretty goddamn close. Like, this is just the easiest. One time a person asked me, they go, "How did you know Khabib Nurmagomedov was going to be good?" And I'm like, dude, it wasn't hard to figure out. You know what I mean? He was coming through and just rearranging people's faces. Like, it was very easy to tell that this guy was something special. Saladin Parnasse is not quite on the Khabib level, but he's awesome, right? But here's the problem. And this is the problem. It doesn't just affect guys like him. It affects the entire operation. Let me set the context for you. In 2023, the UFC made over $1.3 billion. Now, what does that mean? Here's what that means. That's more than every major MMA and boxing promoter in the entire world combined. Combined. The level of money that they make is unprecedented for any entity in the history of fist fighting in human civilization, short of maybe what they must have done, in ancient civilizations for what kind of bounties, I don't know. But as far as recorded human history goes, you've never seen anything like this. But the problem is, and we discovered this from the antitrust trial, they want to bake in, as a way in which they do business, to lock in athlete compensation at 20% of gross rev or below. In other words, it never exceeds 20%. In boxing, it's the exact opposite. The fighters, the A side, certainly, and I mean, obviously not at the lowest level, but at the top level, those guys are taking home 75, 80%. Like Canelo is taking home 80%. Like, let's just be very clear about that. The house takes 20. It's the model is reversed in MMA, and they just want to keep it at that. And they believe, if they started signing the Saladin Parnasses for the money that they're making on the regional scene, plus let's add a little part to this. John Jones is sitting out asking for 30 million. 30 million sounds like a lot. 30 million isn't even Canelo's guarantee. Canelo doesn't get out of bed for anything less than 35 million. Like, that's where you start with him. Okay. For John to ask for 30 million, whatever else you might think about him, is completely reasonable. But that goes outside of the way in which they dole out athlete compensation. In other words, they have such power over the market, and they have such fealty to their own business model, and they know that consumers basically don't have a choice, at least at that high level. There's other levels you could enjoy it for the level that it's at, but for the highest level, they know you don't have a choice. So what are you going to do? You're either just not going to watch MMA at that level, or you will just deal with it. And for now, people are, for the most part, kind of dealing with it. But as I indicated, with pay-per-view buys being down and ESPN being upset, some cracks are at least starting to emerge.
And does that potentially open for another league to not necessarily take over, but have the opportunity to snatch some fans from the UFC?
No, this is the problem. So you might be like, okay, well, if they're not signing the Saladin Parnasses, and I can name other guys too, Cedric Doumbé, this like amazing kickboxer out of France. By the way, France, one of the hottest markets in all of world MMA. I mean, they're blowing up. And I know, again, growing up in 1980s America, they want you to believe that the French are weak. Boy, I got bad news for people. The French will fuck you up proper, dude. They got hammers over there. Make no mistake about it. It's one of the best judo programs in the world. If you've never heard of Teddy, and I don't know how to pronounce French, but Teddy Riner, Riner. This is a 6'9" dude who looks like the Incredible Hulk, multiple time Olympic gold medal winner. I mean, the level of athletic pedigree is insane in France, right? So just understand something. But sorry, what was the question? I lost my mind here for a minute.
The funny thing is, as you're talking about that, I am
Yeah.
Googling Teddy Riner because I have
Yeah.
to see this guy. Yeah, he is massive.
Massive, bro.
Massive. Oh my
Massive.
gosh.
And he bosses around people on that world stage. Make no mistake about it. So, so like, I forget where you were going with this.
The
Can you restate
question
the
was because you were talking about how the UFC, taking advantage of fighters and viewership with pay-per-view might be going down. Does that leave an opening for another league?
Right. Okay. So the answer is, if you wanted to build a French market, like we want to be big in France, we want to be big in other parts of Europe, Spain or Germany, that is possible. You can do something like that. But the reality is not really. What I'm about to tell you sounds like wishy-washy nonsense. And the first time I heard it, I didn't believe it either, or at least I had questions about it. But this is really the way prize fighting works. And we know this is the way prize fighting works because we've seen it in boxing long time ago, and we've seen the process repeated ad nauseum. This is something else the UFC knows. So in boxing, you've seen this today. The brand that airs on ESPN is called Top Rank, and the another brand that used to air on Showtime was the one I used to. Well, I didn't work for the brand, but Showtime worked with the brand, so we did their shows. Was PBC. PBC and Top Rank recently announced that they're going to start doing, hey, our guys versus your guys. We'll just mix and match because they want to promote against Saudi Arabia. But the point is that they do what's called co-promotion, right? Mm-hmm. Top Rank and PBC work together to make a show. We'll bring our best, you bring your best. We'll give the fans what they want. The UFC refuses to co-promote, and it's not by accident. Now, they might tell you, well, why do we need to co-promote? Like, what does anybody else have what we want? And the answer is, well, not everything, but certain things. So, for example, Francis Ngannou competes for the secondary league that's out there called the PFL. They air on ESPN as well. John Jones versus Francis Ngannou was a fight that fans absolutely want to see. No question about it, and had for a long, long time. There's other ones they want to see John in, like, with Tom Aspinall, a different guy, but certainly that was a hot fight, but they wouldn't do that. And this is the reason why. At any point in the history of modern prize fighting, especially since the belt system came into play, there have been a series of champions that the public kind of widely recognizes as those are the guys that have the most legitimacy, right? And this has changed who it was or what belt it was at that time, but there's essentially been a group of them that you could identify. But in boxing, it kind of changed over time because, sometimes it would be the WBC champ, sometimes it would be the IBF champion. Fight fans didn't know the sanctioning bodies, but they kind of knew that guy who had those titles was relevant for any number of different reasons, that he had one or two of three of those belts, right? So, something like that. The UFC can claim legitimacy over all the champions, right? So it's not to say that all their champions are the best fighters, but who does the public recognize as the legitimate weight class champions in mixed martial arts? It's the UFC champions. Mm-hmm. They don't know what it means to be the PFL welterweight champ. They don't know what it means to be the KSW bantamweight champion. Like, these are considerations that seem nonsensical to the point of irrelevant. And the only way in which you confer legitimacy on someone who fights for PFL or KSW or anybody else is for there to be cross-pollination, for a co-promotion. If one of the PFL champions was able to go and fight a UFC champion and beat him, this would confer status upon him. This would confer legitimacy upon him as who the public recognizes. But that's not the game the UFC plays. They ice them all out. So this is what I mean. Like, you can't just develop an MMA organization. You can sign good fighters and you could put on good fights. Please don't misunderstand me. It's not like you're going to watch it and be like, well, these guys are obviously garbage. That's not the conclusion that you would come to. But you can never grow past any kind of stage if you can never get legitimacy conferred on your champions. And the UFC has iced out anybody at least in the North American space anyway, from being able to do that. And I would argue more globally, except for, like, there are certain regional markets where their regional champion is quite important to them. But, short of that, they've got the whole thing on lock. And Fight fans sometimes ask me like, "What's the problem with monopoly? Like, baseball's a monopoly and the NFL's a monopoly." And the answer is, well, those are very different monopolies.
Exactly.
Those are monopolies where the athletes have significant workplace protections and the ability to negotiate. And more on top of that, those are leagues where the teams themselves end up maintaining this competitive enterprise between them that kind of keeps the laws of order, established and fair. And there's like obviously not all leagues, but certain leagues have salary caps where, you can't just go ham on just pumping money into this. Like none of that, absolutely none of that exists in MMA. It's just one 800-pound gorilla dictating the rules. And you either like their rules or you just go do something else.
Totally. It's funny that you say they have it on lock. When anyone is researching the story of the UFC in the late 90s, they did not have it on lock. They were pretty much going to be banned. Everyone knows about this at this point. John McCain called it human cockfighting. It was called a blood sport. Bob Arum, according to the Times, called the fighters competing, quote, a bunch of skinheads, close quote. Venues would not host them. They would not. And many of the higher ups at the UFC even said that they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Then a businessman in the state of New York opened up his venues to the UFC, and that was Donald John Trump. The Trump Taj Mahal would host fights, and Dana White even said, quote, nobody took us seriously then except Donald Trump. I would never say anything negative about Donald Trump because he was there when other people weren't. He would say that in 2018. The Ultimate Fighter also helped give rise to the UFC, but do you believe that Trump saved the UFC?
No. They oversell that. I mean, it's funny. I saw there's a filmmaker named Bobby Rozick. So what day is it today? Wednesday. So on Sunday, he had a screening. He's got I thought it was a movie, but it turns out it's a 8-part documentary miniseries called American Promoter. But there's like a 10-year-old interview in there with Dana White. And Dana doesn't insult Donald Trump, but he refers to him and Mark Cuban, because Mark Cuban used to have a television channel called HDNet where he would put on, low-level fights, but he tried to make one big fight and it failed. But he refers to them as like fly-by-night people who don't really know what they're doing. It's like, it's like I'm not saying that he doesn't genuinely like Donald Trump now. He quite clearly does.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear. You asked about like the historical relevancy. Here's the thing. This is the problem with it. It's like, was what Trump did, it was two events basically, was what he did helpful to this organization at that time in a general way for the reasons that Dana White cited? Yes. Trump was helpful to an organization that did not necessarily have a lot of places to go to. And to be clear, remember, this is a sport that is regulated by each state apparatus. They have a regulatory agency called an athletic commission. The New Jersey Athletic Commission, which of course Trump's casino facilities were in New Jersey. The New Jersey Athletic Commission is a very good commission, and it's a prestigious one. And so to have MMA at that time regulated by New Jersey they were trying to show signals of legitimacy to the broader public, like, hey, look at how above board we are. We're not running away from regulation, we're running towards it. We're not going to Tupelo, or we're not going to go to the Gulf Coast where like some random ass Mississippi commission's we're going to New Jersey, right? We're going to go to the premier standard in regulatory athletic commission excellence to do this. And then you need a facility to do that that's got a little bit of a name, a little bit of cachet at that time. And Trump had some of that, and Trump was open to it. And so, he plays a helpful, but I wouldn't call it super meaningful role if you're actually looking at the other mechanisms at the time, the other levers that had to get pulled or were unable to be pulled, that really were the things that saved them or sent them into the next level. What I would say is, imagine you're on a hike and you took a break on the journey, and you found another set of hikers there who are campers, and they shared with you some water, they shared with you some provisions, and then you went on your way. You'd look back and you'd be like, oh, that was really helpful, but like you weren't starving, you weren't you could have made it to the next stop and got water there, kind of a thing. You know what I mean? Like, so it's one of those things where I think what they do, they're trying to spin a political tale, obviously, But if I can give it one more good faith reading, they're vindictive, and so they count enemies very closely, but they also reward loyalty very strongly. And I think that they liked that. I mean, obviously, they were really appreciative of that. And so now that there's like, a political crossover and a more than that, there's more than just political crossover. But now that those worlds are enmeshed, they're trying to gin up this like, hey, if it wasn't for them, we would have died. That's not true. But these were like-minded people who wanted to be in business with each other for quite some time. Let's put it that way.
And we'll touch on the political angles of the UFC, which there are plenty in a moment. But they said that they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Were they also playing that up, Luke, or were they close to bankruptcy?
No, they were not doing well. They were not really selling well on pay-per-view to the extent that they could even get on it. There was a time where they were banned on pay-per-view. They were still enmeshed in all different kinds of regulatory battles. Again, they were winning some of those. And at the same time, like more than that, they were just trying things that weren't working. Like, so for example, you may not remember this. They hired at the time like Carmen Electra to be like the face of for a little while, because they were trying to find, someone who was cool but kind of hip and edgy, and, you know, a beautiful woman, next to these like rough looking guys. They were trying to not soften them exactly, but I guess make them more accessible. And they were trying to get them in Maxim magazine and all kinds of stuff. And this was, these were, I think they had spent on 1 year, like, I forget exactly what the number was, but millions and millions of dollars on these ad campaigns that ultimately did not work. And so they were deep in the hole. I think by the time that the worst they ever got was they were 40 million in the hole, which is which by the way, like, dude, now they could just,
for sure.
they could wipe their ass with $40 million. But at the time, this was, they were on the verge of obsolescence or, pure elimination. But what they keep trying to tell you is like, if it wasn't for those Trump shows, it's like, dude, those were 2 shows in a broader calendar of shows in a broader set of years. Like, yeah, it was helpful, definitely, but this was not make or break by virtue of just that association.
Right. It wasn't heroic.
No, and dude, Trump's casinos fucking sucked at this time. Like, he needed them too. Like, that's the other funny part about it. Like, no one ever says this. And it's like, dude, Trump's casinos were not doing awesome at that time. I mean, they might have been still somewhat profitable, but they didn't last much longer. Like, these were properties that just did not succeed. He needed them too. Like, this is why he was open to it. Now, the one thing you have to say about Trump, if you're going to just talk about his likes and dislikes, he has, I hate to say this, but it's true. He's always been a fight fan. He's always been a fight fan. And that makes a lot of sense. This is the funny part to me, is people will accuse me of having Trump derangement syndrome. And this is my favorite for a few different reasons. But the funniest one to me is like, Trump will say something like, obviously, like insanely stupid and dangerous. And you'll be like, wow, that's insanely stupid and dangerous. And then half of the people who like Trump will tell me, oh, you have Trump derangement syndrome. And then the other half of his supporters will be like, no, actually what he said was great and we love it. It's like, well, you two need to reconcile this. But the point I wanted to make about this is, Trump fought really hard and succeeded in getting Foreman Holyfield at one of his facilities. And he had to use all kinds of underhanded tactics to do it. And I say that in a very particular way, which is, if you didn't know anything else about him, and I was able to tell you what he did to get that fight there and the games he played, you'd be like, oh, yeah, you mean he's a typical scumbag boxing promoter. Like,
with the active war clause, is that what you're referring to?
Well, I mean, but like at his core, like, why did he go into fighting? He might like 2 guys fist fighting, but dude, this guy is built for the fucking circus. He's built for the Carney show because he can win there. He can absolutely win there. I mean, he has some losses there too, but like manipulation inside of that world is like second nature to him. And this is why it's always so funny to me when people are like, oh, you have Trump derangement syndrome. I'm like, you believe a boxing promoter. Like, that's who you trust. You trust the fucking judgment and wisdom of and by the way, not even a very good one, but like a fucking boxing promoter, like the least trustworthy people on planet Earth. And this is your political this is the guy you think has solved our problems. This is your North Star. It's like fucking baffling to me that people can. Same thing with Dana White. Like, oh, Dana White tells like he's a fucking fight promoter. Their job is to lie and scheme. Like, and I'm being serious here. There are every promoter, good ones and bad ones, even the ones you like, even the ones that are good at it, especially the ones that are good at it. These are not trustworthy people. These are not truth tellers. These are manipulators, because you can't do that job effectively if you're an honest broker. And I'm sorry to be like to say it that way, but it's just the truth. Boy Scouts are not effective fight promoters. Dirtbags are.
Fair point. He spoke at the RNC 3 times while we're on the subject. Dana White did.
Yeah.
He has promoted hard right podcasters. He obviously, as I stated previously, said he would never talk bad about Trump. Post January 6th, what stuck out was while the PGA and other leagues would cast him off, Dana White opened up his entire sport to Trump. The UFC welcomed him. They trotted him out. He called Trump's 2024 win karma. He recently joined the Meta board after Trump's election win. I think I saw today that there's a partnership between the UFC and Meta on technology as well. But it is clear with the F Joe Biden chants, the MAGA hats, that the UFC, aside from producing a documentary about Trump called Fighter in Chief, which was released on UFC.
Combatant.
Apologies for butchering that. So I'm being sarcastic. So look, why? Like, I understand that he wants to be loyal. You said loyalty is key with Dana White. But this is above and beyond loyalty, where he has allowed his entire sport to serve as a propaganda arm for a politician.
Well, I mean, again, people, I have seen the media talk about this. I'm glad you're asking it in this way, because I've seen the media talk about this, and they keep talking about this as some kind of ideological evolution, or, this is really about a guy who has right-wing views, and we never really ask like where they come from, except maybe he got radicalized more during COVID, which is true. And he spoke at as you mentioned, 2016 RNC, so he's probably always been conservative for a long time. That's probably true as well, but no one ever really connects the dots. It drives me nuts. Like, you can't understand what they're doing without understanding the power of their monopoly. Like, there's no way a business that feels competitive pressure to reform alienates a significant portion of their fan base. Doesn't happen. How on earth can you do that? I mean, I can point to any other things. I just told you that they don't even want to bid on certain kinds of prospects who are making good money on the fucking regional scene, not even at high level promotions, just the regional scene, because they don't feel pressure that they have to do that. This is what it all happens. I mean, let me just back up a step and say, over the last few years, I've saved almost all of them. I have received probably thousands, if we're counting like emails, DMs, that kind of a thing, thousands of messages from fans being like, I just can't take it anymore. I just can't take it anymore. I can't take, the right-wing politics. I can't take the Trump in my face. Like, you name it, whatever, all the different things that they're doing. And they just have to walk away. And a great example of how much the fan base has been homogenized is in 2019, Trump attended an event in Madison Square Garden. It was between Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal, I think UFC 244 to be specific. And you can even see video of this yourself. And then there's video of Joe Rogan talking about it, being like, Trump got booed. I mean, there were some cheers, but he got booed too. Fast forward to 2014, same venue, same month, November 2024. The other one was November of 2019. And he gets greeted with an absolutely overwhelming applause. I mean, just an absolute, the greeting of a king. And, folks want to say, oh, well, America changed their opinion on Trump. I'm like, not even in deep blue New York is that true. I mean, obviously there were some electoral gains, but he was still upside down there. He still is not popular in New York, relatively speaking. And that's not the reason why he got cheered. The reason why he got cheered is he just homogenized the fan base. He pushed out. Again, I want to be clear. I don't have hard data to support this. No one's really looked into it, but it's something that I feel like I've got an overwhelming amount of observational and anecdotal evidence to at least make some conclusions about. And that is a key one. So many people who think like me have just said they've had enough. But what has been the business penalty to that? Nothing. There is no business penalty. Remember, they've got more guaranteed revenue than ever. Sure, star power is down. ESPN might be upset. Pay-per-view buys are I don't know if they've collapsed, but they've certainly declined to a significant degree. But what is the business penalty to that? Nothing, because the monopoly is able to churn out content. They're able to get these guaranteed revenue deals. By the way, one of their big ways of doing revenue now is like B2B, like government contracting, because it's now part of a broader monopoly in TKO and WWE. TKO is going to these tourism boards and saying, "Hey, pay us a bunch of money, and we'll bring a UFC show and a WWE show." We're talking like almost $20 million that the government of New South Wales in Australia paid them for, I think, the 3 shows. Right? I mean, just an enormous amount of money, and they're doing those deals with like Saudi Arabia and UAE. I mean, they're bringing a show to Azerbaijan. They haven't even been to Spain, and they're going to fucking Azerbaijan. Is that because that Baku has the best MMA market? I mean, don't get me wrong. There's good Azeri fighters, but no, obviously they're taking whatever money that the Azerbaijani government is paying them. And so I bring this all up to say the reason why he made this turn and leaned into it so heavily is because they have created a world where they are absolutely insulated from any kind of pressure. From pressure from media, it doesn't do anything. Pressure from fans, where are you going to go? Pressure from sponsors, who else in this industry is going to have reached that demo like them? Please be serious. And even then, they literally substituted Manscaped for Jeremy's Razors, which talks about how their product is not woke. How the fuck do you have a woke razor? What does that even mean? What does that even mean? What it means is they're not going to bitch when Dana White goes arm in arm with the Tate brothers like another brand like a Schick or a Gillette might. They don't have to worry about any of that. And now on this other end, they can totally push out a portion of their fan base. They can, homogenize the whole thing, and they can now, like, do they like Trump? I'm sure that again, there's no question in my mind Dana White loves Trump and has ideological alignment, but it probably doesn't hurt that you don't have to face any antitrust pressure as long as this guy is in office. And I think Mark Zuckerberg trying to do business with him, and the announcement that you're referencing today is the biggest bunch of nonsense that ever was. Like, we're gonna integrate fan content on Threads. Great. Oh wow, fucking strike up the band and let's pop champagne. Threads is going to be popping this year, gang. Like, it's total nonsense. It's a complete nonsense. Why are they enmeshing their business? Because Trump, as you know, just offers a protection racket to his friends, and everything, once you understand that them insulating themselves from pressure is how they do their business on the fight side, why they've gone so political, like everything downstream from that, it makes total sense. That's the lens that you have to do. And I know I'm rambling. Let me give one more example.
Please.
They do this thing where like their fighters will say like crazy shit. So they had Bryce Mitchell say things like, and this is not a super educated guy. I'm just trying to be honest about that. But he says things like, oh, before Hitler did meth, I would have gone fishing with him, and the greedy Jews were taking over his country. And he says like this, these insane things. Now Dana White did come out and like speak out against him and call the guy stupid, like literally called him stupid. So he clearly tried to like ideologically distance himself from him, but he didn't. There was no suspension, there was no fine, he didn't cut him, like nothing. There was nothing. And listen, there's a debate over what the right answer is about how to punish people for these various forms of things you find. Like, do you want to be in business with these people or not? But the point I want to make is they do nothing. And more to the point, when another guy, Sean Strickland, says crazy things, this last time he went out there and said, just Google Sean Strickland quotes. I don't even want to repeat them. He was on the cover of an Australian magazine or a newspaper, and they were like, knock this guy out. And the UFC tweeted it. So not only are they not doing anything when these guys say this kind of stuff, they're then cashing in on it. They are absolutely immune to pressure. But the point is, they claim what they're doing is free speech. Guys, I'm sorry. You have to be a little bit gullible to look at that and say what this is really about is a commitment to people's speech. And what it's probably more about is it just so happens that this speech policy, along with all of their other ones, it enables them where they never have to stop. They can always, remember, they have to deliver a certain amount of inventory to get that guaranteed revenue. I never have to pull a guy off a card. I never have to pull a card. I never have to cancel an event. I never have to do any of these things. There's no impediment to my business, so it can just run forward and I can deliver on all these things and I can get all that guaranteed revenue. It's not a commitment to free speech. It's a commitment to monopoly and using free speech as the reason.
Right. I remember, because that's ringing alarm bells with Sean Strickland when he was in Canada. And basically, he wore a shirt saying, like, you know, women go back in the kitchen, and he said being trans is a mental illness, and he questioned if a Canadian reporter slash journalist was gay and if they would raise their kid gay, and how you're a weak effing man if you do something like that. So Dana White came out and said, free speech, brother, free speech, and just sort of played up that angle, which was pretty gross. But what I have a problem with is Dana White didn't used to be this way. He, back in the day, would punish guys if they said the wrong thing. Is this just 2025 Republican acceptance and him knowing that if he were to potentially, like we saw it with the Bud Light deal, the amount of crap that he got in that, he probably doesn't want a repeat of that. So is it just like allowing these guys to say whatever they want because of the times we're in, and he doesn't want to alienate his audience?
I'm sure that's part of it. I'm also sure that, you know, I doubt this might be a more authentic version of what he wanted to do all along. You know, Nate Diaz used a gay slur, I don't know, circa 2012, something like that, and got fined a small amount for it, you know, as part of by the way, they have a thing on the books called the Code of Conduct. They don't even use it anymore. In part because they don't want to blur the line anymore between independent contractor and employee. These guys are independent contractors, and of course, if they become employees, it becomes a different proposition about what they're entitled to, you know, so they're trying to maintain some of that. But, you know, I think it's partly just a reflection of, you know, free from the shackles of woke. This is what we would have done anyway. But I think the other part of it is also we're just living in an era where, like, we're just living in the era of grifters and non-accountability. I just think that is part of the way in which society is in the United States is functioning right now. And then the other part is also, you got to remember, when they were striving for mainstream acceptance, they would do anything to get it. I mean, not anything, but they would do, you know, they'd play ball. They'd play ball. Dude, I mean, understand something. Senator Harry Reid used to be one of their best friends. Like, Lorenzo Fertitta and Dana White were close with Senator Harry Reid. Of course, he was a senator from Nevada, which is where the UFC is based and everything. But, like, you know, this is a very clear Democrat, and they were friends with him. And, you know, this is not like a thing that never used to happen. But once they reached mainstream status, and then once I think other factors hit where, you know, Dana White often says things like, I want to be able to be in business with people who share my values. And that doesn't sound insidious in any kind of way. And on some level, it's not. Like, most people want to be in business with people who share their values. But what that also means is that he doesn't want to have to ever compromise. He can't stand the media. He doesn't want to ever have to say he's sorry. He doesn't want to have to ever, dude. And this is true in, like, fight contracts. Like, dude, the UFC hates when fighters try to leverage them. Oh, they can't stand that. So, like, you know, I'm going to sit out for a year, and either you pay me or I'll sit out. They'll just let you sit out.
Yep.
They're not going to come up off their pot. They can't stand it. And so the point I'm trying to make here is there's probably they're not striving for mainstream acceptance anymore. In this country, like, how much more popular can MMA be? Not much anymore. Like, this individually big fights can be popular, but as a sport, this is probably about the saturation point, give or take. And between that, COVID radicalization, total insulation from business pressure with monopoly, and, you know, again, we have to meet a content delivery. So remember, in COVID, they wanted to just do shows before anybody knew what the proper protocol was, and they got shut down. Remember, they had to do that because if they didn't deliver on that content, they would not get the same amount of money from ESPN. So it was, like, very, very important that they met those contract demands. The most important thing for the UFC is that the trains leave the station on time. We have a card, the fighters show up, they make weight, the event goes on, and then we do it again, and we do it again. It's banquet food, right? You have to always be able to deliver large swaths of it, and that's like a machine that has to run. That's what's most important to it. That's what they want to do. And anything that gets in the way of it is the problem. Anything that facilitates it, they're going to emphasize. So it can be those other factors that you mentioned. I just don't know how you can, for me, as somebody who's like watched this kind of thing develop, people want this to be a completely separate thing from the way in which they run their business. And to me, everything is downstream from that.
We've talked about the effects of Dana White on the UFC, Donald Trump on the UFC. I am curious of your opinion on the effect of Joe Rogan. His audience is massive. He is now not number one anymore. He is a top 3 podcast in the world. His YouTube subs are insane. He's nearing 20 million. Instagram nearing 20 million. Twitter, over 15 million followers. As of February 2025, this is via Podscribe, he had 51.5 million downloads and plays. He was thanked by Dana White in the post-election speech, and he attended the inauguration. He went from, as a lot of people like to joke about, the Fear Factor host to being one of the biggest voices, arguably, in the media space in the world. What is your opinion of his effect on the UFC and also this new wave of UFC fan?
I mean, there's just no way to say he's anything other than deeply influential. Again, these are facts that you can like. These are facts that you can hate, but you have to just kind of reconcile with where they are. Cards on the table. For folks listening, I was on his show in October of 2020. Very friendly in person. We only discussed MMA for anyone. We didn't discuss anything else. We just discussed MMA, and or for the most part anyway. And but I have a feeling that I ruffled some feathers on the show with what I said, and I was not invited back, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. But that's my theory is that the two are related. I cannot prove that, but that's my theory. But there's simply no denying he is enormously influential. I think, he has somewhat benefited from the association with them early on, because he was kind of more like the Fear Factor guy. Dude, I knew him as the news radio guy. I mean, that's, I'm kind of an old fucker in that way. And then, he began to really get some shine from his association with the UFC, but then somewhere it flipped, and then he was the one conferring status upon it. And I think that has proven to be extremely influential with, getting young men to watch, bigger audiences more generally. It has, mainlined that world into MAGA world, into Rogan world, which are, overlapping but distinct as well. And, it has been a hugely influential figure in who watches the sport and for what reasons. At the same time, I would say that the hardcore fan is quite fatigued with him. It does not appear that he does a significant amount of research before calling fights. He does probably some. And to be clear, that's not me saying he's not knowledgeable, but that's different than, did you watch tape on, the undercard guys? Did you watch their last 7 fights to get ready for this? That's a very different kind of thing. And I think that shows up in the way in which he broadcasts. I think that the hardcore fan believes that he has ideas that are either bad or outdated. Even recently this week, there was a controversy where he believes that, and he's asking in earnest, right? He's not doing the Stephen A. Smith thing, but in this case, he was asking why do we not, currently on the stem of your neck where it leads to kind of that point on the back of your head, you're not allowed to strike that area in MMA for obvious reasons. Right. But Rogan was like, you should be able to hit to the back of the head. And it's yeah, but Joe, you also had on a polio vaccine truther. I mean, his sense of safety is highly questionable at this point. But as it pertains to MMA kind of conversations, or even, who are the best all time, he does not have what I would consider to be opinions that the hardcore fan respects as much as they once did. But again, the bigger picture is I don't think you can understand MMA's popularity without him, frankly.
Understood. Why did you ruffle some feathers, do you think, at least?
Because I talked about the athlete pay. And I don't think that did me any favors. This is the other part too. Oh, we're a free speech company. Dude, there's never been a more North Korean sports organization than the UFC. I mean, it's fucking ludicrous that the organization that has banned journalists, the organization where, dude, I've had matchmakers call me up and just angrily yell at me for fairly anodyne comments. To say nothing of, as I mentioned, of other people being banned. Dana White recently telling Forbes he wants to have influencers cage side and put the media up in the stands. He wants to get rid of media rankings and go to a meta AI system. I mean, just total antipathy to reporting, total antipathy to anyone else having any kind of say over the product or any having an opinion that it gets out of line. It's just completely ludicrous that this is an organization that can claim the mantle of free speech, to say nothing of what I think their true motivations were, as aforementioned. It just blows my mind that this is a thing that people even like. That's what I just kind of can't believe. It's like, how do people take this seriously? Like this, I've never seen a sports organization that tries to control the message more than them. I've
Yes.
never seen it. Maybe Saudi Arabia. That's it. Like that's it. That would be their only competitor. The whole notion to me is kind of absurd. That doesn't really answer your question, but
No, but I am curious though, because you said you brought up fighter pay. This is something that has gained a lot of steam as we've learned so much about the organization. What was Rogan's reaction when you advocated for it?
there is no reaction to have. I mean, it's the same one he had this week to finding out that like Trump was deporting people, and
Uh,
then the government's own lawyers are in court being like, yeah, it was an administrative error, it shouldn't have happened, but now we just can't get him back from Bukele's dungeons. You know what I mean? Like
mhm.
it was kind of like that. Like he can tell that it's not good, but
But he has
I
to
think
play ball with the
he
league.
has to play ball. I think he's loyal to the UFC as well. You know what I mean? He's had I mean, Joe's had the best job in MMA for almost 30 years, and for the vast majority of that time has done it quite well. Um, so I think he's quite loyal to them. But dude, this is the thing I'll say. There is no argument. There is no argument. The argument's over. It's
Mhm.
over. There was an argument for a long time. Are these guys underpaid? And there was all these different ways that people tried to look at it to kind of make an assessment, or maybe this kind of fighter relative to boxing makes more. And there are some differences to an extent along those lines, but the reality is we know what the score is. The house keeps most of the money. They give very little away, and that's not an accident. It's by design, and we know all of that because of the antitrust trial. They turned over all these documents. Not only was that, they've got emails like, it's kind of funny. Like in antitrust cases, a lot of times my understanding is like lawyers have to like, they'll subpoena the Slack messages of Microsoft employees, and then they have to kind of like infer what they're saying to one another. They've got emails between like Dana and Lorenzo, or text messages being like, we're gonna we're gonna completely conquer this industry and choke out all the competitors so that they have no way of ever competing with us legally ever again. You know what I mean? Like Gargamel level, just laying out your plan to go get all the Smurfs, no ambiguity whatsoever. And I drew attention to that. I've drawn attention to that for a long time. I've kind of given it up more recently because a very painful lesson that I had to learn was that I don't think the fighters care. And I know that sounds bizarre, but I don't think that the vast majority of the evidence indicates that they don't really care. And
That's
so I
shocking.
stopped. There are some that do quite clearly. I want to say that, but it is man, that's the most painful lesson I've learned in almost 20 years covering this sport, is that I thought that you could present to them all this evidence that A, they're underpaid, and that B, there's a couple of different ways to rectify this, and that the overwhelming majority would shrug, and that some would even be hostile at you for doing it. And that's a reality. And so I've just kind of walked away because I don't really know how fruitful it is to keep contributing to this issue. But you asked about what I said on Rogan, a lot of that.
Yes, for sure. The irony is, I was going to ask if the fans cared, not if the athletes cared. I was going to ask you, do the fans give a shit that this antitrust lawsuit is revealing so much about the business model, or are they just, does it basically just fall on deaf ears within their fan base?
They don't care generally. And again, who can blame them if the fighters don't care? Why should the fans?
Fair.
Seriously, I would say that they care in one very important respect, which is are you guys, and you guys being the UFC, speaking as a fan, are you guys going to pay the money to make the big fights? Right? Are you going to sign these prospects that we want to see? And you're going to put them in fights that we care about? Are you going to sign money to put on big, like, so right now the big one that we're waiting on is John Jones, Tom Aspinall. And, the UFC is probably going to give him a little bit of a bump in pay, but it seems unlikely that they're going to give him what he's asking for because they just never do that. So, maybe he'll be the exception that proves the rule. I don't know, but they care in that sense. Like if it affects ultimately what gets delivered to them, and they can tell the UFC is being cheap about it. Like if you just look at when I first got into MMA, the light heavyweight division was the marquee division. So this was Rampage, Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, Vitor Belfort, Ricardo Arona, Babalu Sobral, Vanderlei Silva. I mean, I could go on and
Huge
on.
names.
Just gigantic, like pillars of the industry, right? The light heavyweight division now is fucking horrendous. I mean, it's pathetic. It's terrible. There's a couple good names at the top. Few good names, I'll say. There's a few good names at the top, and that's really about it. Like, it's a complete disaster. Dude, you used to have a division where you had guys like Josh Barnett, this incredible grappler, and he could do more than that, but he was really known for that. Cain Velasquez, Fabricio Verdum, and Bigfoot Antonio Silva, Alistair Overeem. I could go on down the list. Junior Dos Santos, a prime Stipe Miocic. You look at the heavyweight division now, dude, and if Tom Aspinall, who's kind of like the big guy right now, if he doesn't get this John Jones fight, when I tell you that there is no other fight that they can make among another active heavyweight that anybody would care about, I'm not exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating. It has fallen into disrepair. And that kind of a thing gets the fans animated about pay because you can kind of clearly tell if they put a little bit more money into this, more people might be interested in doing it. But short of that, and again, I kind of understand it. Like if they can't be bothered, why should we?
Mm-hmm. One name that you brought up, which was shocking when I saw, not shocking, when I saw the video, was more so just disgusting, not necessarily shocking, was when Dana White greeted Andrew and Tristan Tate at a UFC event. He dapped them up. The cameras...
A power slap event, if we're being fair.
Power slap, excuse me. Where he dapped them up and said, "Welcome to the States, boys," close quote. Andrew Tate, if some are somehow unaware at this point, via The Guardian, Tate says women belong in the home, can't drive, and are a man's property. He thinks rape victims must bear responsibility for their attacks and dates women age 18 to 19 because he can, quote, make an imprint, close quote, on them, according to videos he posted online. He poses with fast cars and guns, portrays himself as a cigar-smoking playboy, talks about hitting and choking women, trashing their belongings, and stopping them from going out. He is facing criminal investigations. He's facing criminal accusations in Britain over sexual misconduct. That's via the New York Times, and an investigation in Romania over human trafficking and money laundering. Both brothers deny the accusations. Why be so cozy with them?
I'm going to guess it's a few things. One, again, just imagine you lived with complete and total impunity about the things you liked. Now, you don't like rancid things, but maybe even just like in a cringe way, like maybe like you have or anybody out there is like, oh, I'm really into, I don't know, Pokemon. And I'm not here to like bash Pokemon, but I'm just saying some other kind of thing that only you like, that you have to kind of keep to yourself to a degree, or you put some kind of limits on to what extent you make it you share those details publicly. Imagine you just that veil is just absolutely lifted. You don't care at all. I think that's part of it. Part of it is that the introduction came through the NELK boys. And just dullards, if there ever was one. Have they read a book between them or among them? I don't know. Certainly they have a very successful podcast, God bless them. But
very successful.
But they I think that was the conduit, because they initially were with them, and then Dana greeted them kind of like through the NELK boys, like all in one group together. I think that was part of it. And the other part of it is probably he just has like, terrible ideas about the world. I don't think that's necessarily some kind of, and partly on top of it, I'm not going to believe, bullshit mainstream media. I'm going to believe what I see with my own eyes, kind of a dodge, more nonsense about never having to make an actual adult decision about like ethics, So I think it's all those things. But again, like you could think a lot of things about the Tates, but a lot of people would be pressured to hide them. I'm going to ask you, what was the fallout? Again, by the way, to be clear, some people on the right, in fact, a fair amount of people on the right were horrified by that too. Like that was so radioactive that they were like, God damn, that's brazen as hell.
Mhm.
But I mean, what did it do to the UFC's business?
Nothing.
Nothing,
Nothing.
zero. They are absolutely insulated from everything. So if you have terrible ideas about the world and there's like nothing you do ever results in any kind of public opprobrium, go ham, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It should be noted as well that there is a charge of rape for Andrew. There were search warrants conducted over potential trafficking of minors and intercourse with a minor. The Romanian prosecutors accused both brothers of organizing a criminal group in 2021, trafficking women in the United States, Romania, and Britain. There were a lot of fighters as well, Luke, that have really shown affection towards them, which is also just kind of gross. Leon Edwards said he had dinner with Andrew and Tristan Tate through a friend. John Jones, this is a direct quote, "I'm just proud of the person he's trying to be." He would then say, "He's trying to help men and women think outside the box. I'm grateful for him." That is a crazy ass quote. That is crazy. That is crazy.
John has John's got issues too.
I understand. I understand. But like again, where is the humanity, man? I'm looking at this and I'm just thinking like, what the fuck? Like, why are these people following some of the worst human beings and then using them as and referencing them in interviews, taking pictures with them? It just feels gross, man.
Yeah, young men are lost in this country. A big portion of them. When I say young, I mean, 18, 34, 18, John's a little older than that, but you get the idea, like around that mark. These are so many guys that are absolutely completely lost. We have terrible male role models. We have terrible influences. We have terrible content feeds that find them. These are radicalizing forces on top of it. Like all of this has given life to the dumbest, least ethical, most odious people around us. And not to the point where not only are they not merely cast out from society, but they're lionized. Like it's just totally of the upside down. I did CNN this morning very briefly for like 5 minutes, but I was on CNN this morning and I talked about this. It's people misunderstand me a little bit on this argument, but it was basically about this, which is I'm not arguing that as a general view, we have to reclaim this group. And what I mean by that is not all of them can be reclaimed, obviously. In fact, a good portion of them probably cannot be, and I understand that. Nor is it about like, oh, I'm just going to meet them where they're at and then just agree that their views are great. It's not that at all. It is rather that like this is obviously just for a practical consideration, an emerging, an important part of the electorate, which it did not used to be. And more to the point, like it's just bad for society for a lot of young men to hold these kinds of views about the world. It's bad for women. It's bad for them as men. It's bad for the economy. It's just bad for everything. Nothing good can come from it. And I think that the left has to find a way to, again, some of these guys cannot be re-engaged. I just understand that. But as a long-term project, it looks like not indulging all of their whims, or again, it's not agreeing with their worldview, but whatever we've done from the left the last 10, 15 years, like look what it brought us.
Mm-hmm.
Like look what it did. Like where are we now? We're in a place where people are holding up this like incredibly radioactive, abnormally awful scum is some kind of figure of adoration. Like things have to go desperately wrong. And I don't think these are just the fault of the left or the left's messaging. It's really not my point. It's again broader forces in play. I think letting the tech bros run wild with how their algorithms work. We like this has been documented to what extent this has been a radicalizing force. Like these are all things that are beyond the purview of just messaging around these guys. But it is quite clear that any place good has to come through the realization that we have to recapture some of that audience, that we have to re-engage with them and not agree with them, but like talk them out of this or again, over time, not message them out of it. Over time, work our way through this to get at least some of them back to a different place because the harm that it causes is absolutely extraordinary. It's a total moral perversion and inversion. It is an inability to do any basic moral reasoning whatsoever. And to me, the only way you actually end up there is if you just simply don't care about making ethical reasoning a part of, like, people don't seem to care about their moral hygiene as much as they once did. And I think whatever it is going to be next, if it's going to work and it's going to be good, has to solve that problem.
You mentioned the NELK boys. This is via Media Matters. Their videos are laser targeted at men, for those who are unaware of who the NELK boys are. Women are typically only included in videos as props. This lifestyle, coupled with the group's right-leaning bias, has led the NELK boys to join forces with extreme misogynists and incel-aligned figures. The group has put out prank videos promoting anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ plus and racist values. They mock trans people. In one prank, they offer free beer to people who they thought were immigrants before tricking them into thinking that officers from ICE were coming to deport them. They are really ingratiated in the manosphere, Bradley Martin, red pill style of content. And correct me if I'm wrong, they really were aided by Dana White over the pandemic, not that it's over, but over the pandemic, when they needed, the UFC felt like they needed content to be done, so they gave them passes to run wild and shoot content wherever they could.
That is basically my understanding. Can I confess I've never seen a single NELK boy video?
Yes, happily. I've only seen it because of my other job, where if they're interviewing like Candace Owens or they say something crazy that and if it gains legs, then it's something that I've reported on in the past. That's the only reason that I've ever sat down for some of these. But to give the audience an understanding, they've hosted Candace Owens, Donald Trump Jr., I mean, pretty much anybody on the right, you name it.
Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of lost men. And the thing I always try to explain to people is I don't know what kind of lives these guys lead privately and to what extent it mirrors the one that they put out in the world. I'm sure that there are some meaningful differences, although I'm sure that there are probably awful people behind the scenes as well. But, you know, it's not a real life advice for anybody else. I mean, this is one thing, like, I'm not some kind of Casanova or anything. I've been married, let's see, I'll be married 13 years this year. You know, I'm not some kind of genius that, I've got it all figured out. Life is hard. Sometimes marriage is hard. But one thing I can say very, very confidently is it's a lot easier to form all kinds of different bonds with women if you actually like them. This is one thing that young men seem to think, that they think it's some kind of issue of like domination, trickery, subjugation, some forms of abuse as control. And it's like, not only is that not appealing for them, and this is where you're going to get, the quality of partner you're going to get in any kind of person who tolerates that, it's probably going to be a little bit low. But then more to the point, like, this is not going to be nurturing for you either. You're not going to get much from this either in any kind of way that is, helping you to a healthier and happier place. We know this. We know this. And so it's like anything that they can show, it's all just about, I don't have to tell you anything about the NELK boys that description doesn't already tell you. But the thing I just try to drive home to audiences, to the extent that I can reach them, is like, just to be very clear, this is real bad for you. This is real bad for you. And they don't see it that way. They see it as like a taste of power. Mm-hmm. And we have to talk them out, or more than that. But I'm using the word talk as like a sort of a figure of speech here about a broader effort. But we have to get them out from a place where they can understand that, like, people always say things like, "Oh, the patriarchy is bad for you," and that message doesn't resonate with them. But when I try to tell them, guys, if you want to go on dates with women, you have to like them first. That seems to be one of those light bulb moments that sometimes I can capture a few of them.
Hopefully. There's another name that is fully in, it seems, with the UFC. At least the UFC fully supports him. And that is Kash Patel. This is a rather fascinating angle. He's a former public defender, federal prosecutor, congressional aide, and national security official in Trump's first term. He vowed to go after Trump's enemies in podcasts. He is a avowed conspiracy theorist. Yet when he was floated as an idea, let's say, to lead the FBI, he received support from the likes of Justin Gaethje, Frankie Edgar, Jorge Masvidal, and others. He has floated the idea of the FBI, now that he's leading, partnering with the UFC. He wants to bring in UFC trainers to help agents' martial arts and self-defense. That's via Reuters. 2 people briefed on the matter said current FBI agents described the idea as surreal and wacky. Dan Bongino, who is the FBI's deputy director and a huge podcaster, inspired Patel to try UFC training, and he fell in love with it. What do you make of all this? Dana White via Newsweek says that they are dead serious about it. Again, he's a promoter, so he's going to promote his brand. What do you make of all this, Luke?
Nothing. I think it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, and I think it's a non-story, if I can be totally honest with you. The only part of the story that I find kind of interesting is it's remember earlier in this conversation I referenced to you that like part of what they're doing is becoming like a B2B business where they're just doing this government kind of contracting through tourism boards. Salt Lake City is a big one, as I mentioned, New South Wales, but you could just list a number of places where this is the case. They want to be paid to attend, and they want to be paid handsomely, and that's where they're going to go. Again, contracted, guaranteed. I mean, there's some variability in that, but they lock these deals up well in advance. So, in whatever their fiscal calendar is, they have a clear sense of what's coming in and what's going out. It's kind of guaranteed revenue to a degree. To me, it's like another way for the UFC to get government money, right? To just get paid by the FBI to do some kind of. I mean, let me just be clear about something. Obviously, the martial arts in general is for anybody who wants it. Like, totally clear. There is any number of benefits to training self-defense, losing weight, building community with the people you train with, the actual help of self-defense itself. Like, the benefits are myriad. MMA training is bad for you, right? It's real bad for you. I've done it. It's not good for you. It's not good for your bones. It's not good for your joints. It's not good for your brain. It's not good for your skin. That can be both cuts. I mean, I've had staph infections. I mean, it's very bad for you. You can tolerate it for a certain amount of time, and if you're very good at it, you can make some money at it, but it's bad for you. Like, it just be very clear it's bad for you. So, like, either what they're going to do for them is give them, like, things that are really, really bad for field agents that they don't even, I mean, like, there used to be a museum here. I live in Washington, D.C. There used to be a museum called the Newseum, and it was where, like, the world story or the world history of news was told. It's since shut down. I actually thought it was a pretty cool museum, but one thing they did was they had, like, a section on, like, espionage and the world of espionage, and they had Ted Kaczynski's The Real Thing. They brought it in, his, like, the shack that he was living in the woods. And you could see it. You could see everything in it. It was amazing to see. But it's like, knowing how to do a triangle choke was not going to get them any closer to finding Ted. I can assure you. Like, that guy was, Ted was a crazy person, but he was a genius, at least very, very bright at a bare minimum. You need a different set of skills to apprehend people like that. Of course, he's something of a unique case, but you understand my point. Like, if you're a member of, like, some kind of SWAT or tactical team, well, that's a different kind of conversation. You might actually need MMA training to save your life or save somebody else's, right? Okay, fair enough. But if you're just like a field agent, this is a complete waste of time. And if you're just going to give them a lighter version, which was the one that would probably be somewhat beneficial, I suppose that's okay. But I would love to see what the government contract looks like that they're going to pay the UFC to do this. It's just another way to funnel money from Trump and his cohorts over back to them. It's a complete non-story in anything that matters for what the FBI is actually designed to do.
Fair point. I have 2 more for you. One huge name that we have brought up is Conor McGregor. I think Kareem Zidane's reporting on McGregor basically post-fighting career has been fantastic. Recently, he visited the Trump White House on St. Patrick's Day. He would say Ireland is at the cusp of potentially losing its Irishness due to a so-called illegal immigration racket. What is going on in Ireland is a travesty. He also attended the Donald Trump inauguration. He was deemed liable for essaying Nikita Han in Dublin in December 2018. The total damages from that trial, over 248,000 euros. According to Zidane, McGregor helped stoke anti-immigrant sentiments that led to one of the most violent riots in Dublin's history. And he has I remember seeing this because I did some reporting on it, but Conor McGregor was seen in an AI image where it basically looked like the Irish version of the Proud Boys. Since he is, it appears, probably most likely done fighting, and Elon Musk, who is very rich because of government subsidies, and also because he obviously came from a very wealthy family in South Africa, has said that Conor McGregor should be president of Ireland. Is he going to two-parter? Is he going to fight again? And what do you make of this political turn that he has had?
Okay, let's answer the questions in the order you asked them. Is he going to fight again? It is possible. I would not rule it out. However, he's going to get waxed. Like if he fights anybody even halfway good, he's going to get hurt real bad. His fighting days in any kind of way that you would recognize them are effectively over. They're not technically over to the point you raise. He also has become a major investor and something of a face of the brand of this kind of like semi-sport called, or it's a sport, but semi-new sport anyway, called bare knuckle. It's bare knuckle boxing, but it's not what you think. It's not like regular boxing, and then they're just not have gloves on. The rules are adjusted. The fighting surfaces is adjusted. Like everything about it is designed for like maximum car crash carnage. But it's actually pretty popular as far as sub UFC combat sports organizations go. He has hinted he might fight for them one day. So there are ways in which you might see him again, but as any kind of, let's just say this, relevant force, he's finished. He's totally finished. Okay, that's the first part. The second part, basically what you're seeing for Americans listening to this, some Americans now know this. The word's starting to get out, but if many do not know this, Conor McGregor is absolutely reviled in Ireland. I mean, he is public enemy number one. They hate him there. It is not ambiguous at all. I've talked to a lot of my Irish colleagues who, for a time may have been a little bit hesitant to kind of criticize for some of his past indiscretions because he was still popular there or he's still a figure of, importance. All that has changed. He is not that at all, and it's not just the Nikita Hand case, the one you referenced earlier. It's any number of different events. And by the way, Nikita Hand is hardly the first woman who has accused him of assault or even sexual assault.
Yep.
She was just the first one to be able to take him to trial, essentially, civil trial, but a trial nonetheless. In any case, he is, persona non grata. So his chance of achieving anything politically is low. Now, we've said that about Trump, and here he is. But, the reality is like Trump cleaned out the RNC and then like restaffed it. Like he completely remade that party in his own image. And part of what that required was them forgiving him for, or not merely forgiving him, but like defending and not even caring about grabbing by the pussy and all this stuff, right? And obviously he also had a trial where he was found liable for essentially uh, his own version of a similar kind of thing that Conor was accused of. I mean, different circumstances, different court systems, but there's a fair degree of overlap. But I mean this to say, the best way to understand Conor is to treat him like Eric Adams. So Eric Adams is the mayor of New York City, and this is a guy who is a political opportunist, if ever there was one. And he basically tells the city, "Don't enforce our sanctuary city laws. Nobody can talk bad about Trump. Blah blah blah." And then they just drop the case against him related to his previous accused impropriety. Conor is looking to launder his image by going full MAGA. That's what he's looking to do. And you might say, well, that's not going to help him with his political ambitions in Ireland. And again, I don't think that it will. But like, just ask yourself a question: like, what world is going to launder your image when you're accused, and in this case, found liable for the things that he has been accused and then therefore done in other cases? Two different places you would go to. One, combat sports, right? They'll forgive, and they don't give a shit who you are, right? By the way, not just true in MMA. True in boxing. The Saudis took over boxing in like a year. Like they don't like, oh, it's a monarchy and a religious dictatorship that throws people in jail for 20 years for tweets. They don't care. They don't care. You can ask yourself, hey, why was the rumble in the jungle in Kinshasa? Google that one. You're not going to like the answer. Like, this is just the reality. You can launder anybody's reputation can be laundered. Now, of course, he does that through, a remained association in combat sports, but the MAGA element is the same kind of thing. That's the other world that's going to absolutely launder your image and just pretend that they don't care about any of that, so long as you profess fealty to their ideals or political vision or you name it. And so it's like, why is he playing by the same kind of playbook that Trump is playing with this anti-immigrant one? Well, that's him showing that if I do these things, I want the kind of, resurrection, so to speak, that he saw Trump get in whatever kind of way he wants it for himself, whether it's this political office or another one down the line, or, whatever it may be. So to me, it's like maintaining this affiliation with BKFC/MMA and UFC, and then at the same time going full MAGA. It's just this I mean, he might believe some of it, I'm sure, but a lot of it is a clear transactional play to go to the two worlds that don't care how much of an absolute dirtbag you are. They'll try and clean you up, or at a bare minimum, just pretend like they don't even care and reintroduce you into the pipeline of power. And I think that's what he wants.
But what also troubles me, and it's positive to hear that he's deeply unpopular. What's troubling to me is that his movement is gaining steam within the worst realms of society. There's a German neo-Nazi MMA league that is sharing his tweets and referencing his tweets. We mentioned the anti-migrant hysteria that is going on with McGregor. I completely agree with everything that you said about how if there is ever an organization or movement to launder his image, these two are certainly it. But it also feels like at this point in time that a lot of it is authentic, that this is probably how he felt. He degrades women. He does not care about his significant other. There's another case, by the way, that is coming up where these are allegations, but it occurred at the Miami Heat's arena. So there's something stateside as well. So yes, laundering image, true, but it also feels like this just may be who he is.
I am sympathetic to that to a degree. I just think that, again, one more time, Donald Trump, boxing promoter. Dana White, MMA, now turning boxing promoter. Conor McGregor, boxing promoter. Guys, like these are the least trustworthy people who will say absolutely anything that they feel like they need to and not care about lying, because once again, to do that job effectively, that's what you have to do. So it takes a certain kind of constitution to do that kind of a job, right? It takes a certain, I mean, it's, again, some are a little scummy, but mostly wholesome, right? That does exist. A little bit dirtbag, but whatever. But then some are just full on dirtbags. So, I just want to remind people that, like, these guys who are taking these jobs as fight promoters, that's really who they are, if anything. But what I would say is, I've been this is going to sound silly, but I've been reading a lot about the philosophical nature of impunity. And I've been reading a little bit. I've actually been, it's been a topic of mine for the last, like, a year and a half. Because I've been trying to understand the same kind of question you're asking, and I want to be clear. I'm I don't have any expertise in continental philosophy or otherwise. But what I would say is, one thing that kind of keeps coming up in my ability to discern anybody who is, or ability to find anybody who has written about this in a way that is in any way relevant, is that impunity, and again, like, to do what he has been found liable for. And again, I reviewed I didn't have the direct evidence, but I talked to a person who covered the trial that he was in. The forensic evidence in that case, to me, does not appear ambiguous. It's not ambiguous. Like, it's again, it's Occam's razor, and we don't have CCTV footage of the alleged act in question, but it seems to me like quite obvious he did what, at least it seems that my belief is that he did what he was accused of doing. I bring us all up to say, I think that there is a point in these lives where, like, oh, it's who they always were. I think that there was a part of that element to who he was. But, like, when you see somebody who acts with impunity, this is somebody who has undergone a bit of moral rot that took time. Impunity and moral impunity in particular stems from somebody who had a moment in time, or maybe several moments in time, where they may have been wrestling with their conscience, or their conscience may have been playing with them, and they were having difficulty working with that. And then they ultimately, either in that moment or again, a series of moments over time, begin to just quiet it on purpose and ignore it. And then once you get to that position, people are like, oh, it reveals the real you. Well, in a sense, it revealed something that was always there, but it reveals that as a metastasized version of itself, right? You are now no longer encumbered by conscience. You are now no longer encumbered by any kind of constraint and thoughtfulness about one's behavior beyond what it transactionally serves or whatever you can demonstrate for public purposes. And I think that's where he has found himself. I think Trump is the exact same kind of guy. I mean, I don't know enough about Trump's biography, but clearly this is not a guy who has, deep reconciliation or does any kind of real reconciling with his moral conscience in any kind of way. And to be clear, I'm not Mother Teresa, but I haven't punted on that as an important exercise. I feel like those kinds of things, they keep you grounded. They keep you sometimes paranoid. You can let it go too far, but you're at least wrestling with your actions and what you owe other people, what you owe yourself, and what you owe the broader community in which you live. And it takes time to undo that, but I think Conor has undone that. And so now it's just naked power plays and this act that he's willing to put on that is, to your point, probably a reflection of who he is, but it's also a reflection of the moral, the journey of moral rot that has developed, that has allowed him to arrive at this position.
Well put. Luke Thomas, I must say, I really appreciated the conversation, and I have been a fan of yours from afar for a long time. I think we first linked up my first stint with the Turks back in 2011. And long time ago, you were doing YouTube videos for SB Nation, but you are the ultimate pro, and I am deeply appreciative of what you bring to this space. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom, your professionalism, and what you bring to the table.
Thanks, man. Well, feeling is mutual. I appreciate you having me on, and if you like more of these incoherent ramblings, follow me on Substack. I'll just say that.
Fantastic. We'll link it down below as well. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Luke Thomas for his time. Please do support his work on Substack, support his social media on Instagram, Blue Sky, what have you. If you'd like to continue supporting this show, and it would mean the world to me, subscribe for free on YouTube, give this a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and write a review. It helps greatly. There are more fantastic interviews coming up in the world of sports, politics, music, and more. So stay tuned.